Welcome to PianoInspires podcast, celebrating pianists, teachers, and innovators as they share their inspiring stories about the transformative power of music.
I do believe that music represents life. If you have a sense of adventure, your students will have a sense of adventure. The people that I knew closely didn't want me to go into piano teaching. They thought I could do something else, something bigger, something more important than piano teaching. And of course, I had just the opposite feeling that piano teaching could be very, very important. Nobody's born unmusical. And no matter how small that seed is, you find it and you nurture it. You water it. You put it in the sunlight and it grows. And to see children learn is the most thrilling thing to do. Da, 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 da. You play those as 2 even 8 notes. Just play that measure.
Play it again?
Yes. No, just that measure. Yes, but what is the most important note in that measure? Yes! Love that note. And then just sort of slide down into the return of the melody. Again. Yes, good, good. Now you play your 2 slurs again. Ah, better. Now the whole right hand. Just the one measure again. G, da, 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 da. Okay. Now from the beginning. The message that she's talked about over and over and over and year after year after year is that every child has music.
Dr. Seuss has said that adults are simply obsolete children. Frances has gone the other way around.
Definitely.
She treats them as though they were potentially going to grow up to be adults, to be important people, to be musicians.
She brought an infinite love and respect for the child and the child's integrity, and a boundless faith in the value of music study for everyone.
Bravo! Isn't singing wonderful? It always helps us play better.
I think another thing that she did certainly was to change the whole image of piano teaching. Instead of piano teaching as an adjunct to a performance career, or as something one does because one doesn't feel totally comfortable or successful as a performer, piano teaching has become a bona fide profession.
We had a sense of dignity. We had a sense of worth. And as I said before, something I felt from teenage, a sense of usefulness. I was performing a service that was needed.
The integration of teaching and performing and the training to be teachers and the training to be performers, that was the most important thing that was happening. And that's what made everything exciting.
What was immediately noticeable, significant in Frances Clark and her work that you felt right from the very beginning?
Well, maybe this isn't significant, but first she was a blonde bombshell. She was an absolute dynamo, and anything she would have taught would have been the most exciting thing going. The fact that she approached piano teaching as a logical, artful process, which could be learned, which could be taught, which could be communicated according to the same good teaching and learning principles of any other subject, fascinated me, because none of my other musical experiences had included that. And when I experienced that myself, and more important, I think, when I saw this working with young children who were studying with her and whom I was privileged to watch, I realized that this was a really exciting new way of looking at learning music, and I was just completely captivated.
The first thing I do need to say is how exciting this is for me, to be able to sit here and be able to go over your life and your achievements. It's personally an honor, and it's personally very exciting to to be able to get to know someone of your importance, of your lasting contributions to our profession, and as somebody, as part of the younger generation, to be in this chair is a real thrill. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice of you to say that. Remember, I'm excited too.
Fred Kern has quoted you as saying that you had always known that you wanted to be a teacher, and that the question in your mind was, what subject would you teach? When was it that you first realized that you would always teach?
Well, that's a question very difficult to answer because there was no one moment. I just grew up teaching. I played teaching. That was part of my games. Getting children to come and sit on the front porch, and I taught them. And it went on that way even in grade school. If a teacher was absent or sick, it would be, Francis, would you come and take this class? It was terrible. I had no right to do that. They had no right to ask me, but there was no one moment. I never had the excitement of suddenly deciding I'm going to teach. I just always was going to teach.
And at what time did you realize that piano education was really the best area for you to devote your teaching?
Well, that's a very different story. That's a long one. That was when I was asked in college to assist the teacher that I was studying with. I had never taught before, ever. And he thrust me into this group of children, well, all ages, from 8. I had from 8 to 12 students every year I was in college to teach. And it was a terrible thing to do to those students. I had no training for teaching. I didn't know how to teach piano. But it was also an awakening, because it was then that I knew that there was great teaching, that somehow it hadn't gotten into me in the area of piano. And I was going to be a piano teacher, and I was going to use some of the same principles that my great teachers in other subjects had used. And I decided to teach piano. And those teachers are still very, very important to me. I think the Latin teacher I had in high school, who, when we translated from Latin into English or from English into Latin, she wouldn't correct any mistakes. We had to correct our own mistakes. And of course, in learning how to correct your mistakes, what you're really learning is how not to make that mistake in the first place. She was teaching us how to learn. Why couldn't we do that in piano? And it's just been a series of those, just constant awakenings.
Can I review just a few of those teachers? I'd like to ask you to respond to some of these names and talk about the kind of teacher that they were, and perhaps the role that they may have played in your life. Miss Bender, for example, from high school.
Oh, Miss Bender. I did my practice teaching in English literature, and she supervised my practice teaching. And she taught me more than any other one person that telling someone something doesn't necessarily mean he knows it. And to teach, you create a situation in which the student experiences it, and then he begins to know it. And that's the way she lived. It was quite wonderful.
Tell me about Dr. Simpson, your professor of English at Kalamazoo College.
Well, he was dynamic. And the 3 hours a week that I had on any subject with him were the fastest 3 hours in the whole week. Every character in every play, in every poem was alive. We knew them intimately. He brought everything right down to today. I was the heroine. I could be the hero. He had a wonderful imagination, and we all shared in it. It was a very live situation. And one of the most interesting things about him was when he asked questions. He never asked anything that would help us to answer what he had already said. It was always, can you use what you know? It wasn't, can you repeat what I have said? Can you use it? And then, of course, I always had in the back of my head those piano teachers, those piano students that I was teaching.
And how you could apply it.
How I could translate it.
Your first piano teacher, Minna Stewart.
Do you really want to know about her?
Yes, I do.
Well, in the first place, it was Mina Pyle Stewart. If you were to call her Mrs. Stewart, she would object because the pile in there seemed to be very important. But I could tell you a lot about her by just telling you about her first few lessons, my first few lessons with her, because they had a routine in them that I think you'll find fascinating. The way she made assignments was just to put a big check at the left of the piece. That meant I was to practice it. So when I came in the next week, I sat on the stool. She sat in a great big chair beside me, a big comfortable chair, because she was a big comfortable woman. And I played the piece, and she erased the check. I played the second piece, and she erased the check. And that was the process. I played, and she erased. That was the first half of the lesson. And then we came to the next part of the lesson, where she checked again. So she would go on and check the next piece and the next piece, whatever I was to practice, sometimes making comments and sometimes not. And then the lesson was over, and she gave me a cookie. And I found out that she made good cookies. That's the lesson.
Maybe we should move on to your second piano teacher, Sam Robinson.
Well, that was very different. It just happened that when Mina Pyle Stewart completed, or I completed the Matthew series that she taught, had completed, it was the very moment that Sam Robinson began teaching in Sturgis. That's where I lived. He came from a nearby college to teach on Saturdays, and of course he opened up a completely new world to me. It was as if I had never had a piano lesson. Music became something entirely different. It was something to think about. It was something to feel. And while he was an absolutely new teacher, he had just come from studying with Joseph Levine. So if you know Joseph Levine, that means you play an octave with fingers 1 and 4 instead of fingers 1 and 5. I still do that once in a while.
Let's go on to Isidore Philippe, your teacher in France.
Well, you can't talk about Isidore Philippe without also talking about his assistant, Mademoiselle Herschmidt. I studied with him at Fontainebleau and then later in Paris. And he's the only piano teacher I ever had, or even know, that I would like to describe as loving and lovable. You liked him very much, and you know that he liked you, which is certainly number one in teaching. And when I was having a private lesson with him, I was the most important person in the world to him. Of course, everyone else felt the same way about them, and that's the way they should feel. But it was quite beautiful.
Around 1925, you were, while still an undergraduate, assistant to H. Glenn Henderson, who was professor of piano at Kalamazoo College.
Yeah.
And you began your first teaching experiences, and as assistant to him, you were a teacher without benefit of a pedagogy class or teacher training of any sort. How did you manage?
Well, that's what I've mentioned slightly before. That's when I had what I call an awakening, realizing that I didn't know a thing about how to teach. I had these great teachers from whom I was learning a lot in all these other subjects. But how could I use what they taught to help these poor children? And I think, in the last analysis, I ought to see all of them again as adults and pay them all the money that they paid me. Because I'm afraid a lot of teaching, once in a while, teaching is done by a teacher who has no idea how to teach. I spent lots of time going through music. I spent lots of time trying out things. I gambled with ideas. And I shocked my teacher, H. Glenn Henderson, with some of the things I did. And I shocked myself with other things because they turned out so well. I was learning something. I was finding out something. But I knew then that the only thing I wanted to do was find out more about how to teach and teach piano.
It sounds like you used it, though, as a laboratory experience.
That's right. That's very good. I didn't learn as much as I wanted to learn, but I did learn what I wanted to do next. I wanted to be a piano teacher.
But you also showed the same kind of risk-taking that has characterized your career.
I guess that's true. I think that's true. I wasn't afraid. You can't ever be afraid to be wrong, because you're going to be wrong part of the time. So do what your intuition tells you to do, and if you win a big percent of the time, you're on your way.
And it provides a motivation for going on to next steps.
Yeah.
Following your graduation from Kalamazoo College, you taught high school English for 2 years.
That's right.
At Sturgis High School.
That's
What
right.
did you gain from that experience?
Well, if you want me to be wholly honest, I gained enough money to be able to go to Europe for a year. That wasn't the whole thing, though. I loved it. I learned a lot. I taught English literature the way I was hoping I would be teaching piano, with some imagination, making everything alive, not having it be a class of recitation, but having experiences. And I really thoroughly enjoyed it. But I was resenting a bit the fact that I wasn't teaching piano. And I even wondered if I wanted to go on studying piano. At least go to Europe for a year to study, because I wanted to begin a studio. I wanted to open a piano studio and get to my job.
So you're saying that you knew before you left for Europe and your year of study in Paris that you wanted to get on to your career as a piano teacher?
Yeah.
So what did you gain from that year in France, and what did you bring back that influenced your subsequent career as a piano teacher?
I did have the European experience. I had living there, being acquainted with people, seeing how the French loved music the way we did, that they were more knowledgeable than we were. I learned a lot about that we're not the only country in the world. And of course I learned a lot more about playing the piano. I practiced 6 hours a day, of which 2 were technique, and Philippe wanted 4 hours of technique.
And so did you come back with more vigor, more ambition to then find out more about the teaching act itself?
Yes, and more ambition about continuing to study piano.
Which you subsequently did with
Guy Mayer.
With Guy Mayer,
Yeah.
Right.
I began studying with Guy Mayer as soon as I returned from Europe. And he was a shock to me because he was just the opposite from my former teacher in France. He was a genius in some ways. He was a genius in that he could change the way a person played in just a few minutes. He could change a very good piece into an absolutely fantastic performance. Or he could change an excellent piece into something that would make you think you were working or listening to a real artist. And he did it in just a few minutes. And he held teachers, of course, he held them in the palm of his hand while he was doing it, anybody that observed him. If you were to walk into a room, things started to happen. You wouldn't sit like this with him in the room. You would start, you would know that something was going to pop. And something always did, and some of the things that popped weren't so pleasant. He wasn't always a very agreeable person. But it's both magic and it's a mystery, because you can't define where it came from. But I did some stupendous playing when I was studying with him. But I don't do it now.
You miss it, I'm sure. Yes. In 1945, you joined the Kalamazoo College faculty to institute probably what is the first pedagogy program in the United States. Did you realize back then what a landmark that was, what a first time achievement that may well have been?
No, I couldn't have known that, but I was awfully excited. I was doing what I wanted to do. It was great.
Was it again, another laboratory, another experiment that you...
Yes, but then all of teaching is a laboratory. The more you use that word, the more I'm convinced to agree with you, that you're always trying things. Your teaching is never fixed. You can't say, this is the way I do, because you don't know the other person yet. You respond to the other person. Also, you respond to yourself. You aren't the same today as you were last year. Something's happened to you too. So it's always a process.
Frances is known to piano pedagogues as one of the creators of the interval approach to music reading, which was once revolutionary, but now incorporated into almost every major piano method. She's known as a major organizer of materials for piano students. The Frances Clark Library was a landmark achievement in that department.
I was 5 when I started, and I was with her until I was 22. And when she did the library, she really listened to our reactions, and she incorporated our ideas too. And it was a wonderful adventure. She put us in contact with great musicians and musicologists and performers. We were coached by Julius Herford, Hans David. We worked with Rossley Finney, whom I went on to record a few years ago, Alexander Cherepnin.
So I went up to Kalamazoo to meet Frances and Louise and told them I thought they ought to organize this marvelous resource called the Clayton F. Summey Piano Teaching Library into something else, more like a method. And then I went away to Korea. I was recalled in the Army. And when I got back, they told me, well, it's really not adequate. We need more literature. And they began to research piano literature of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. They began to intrigue and machinate to get contemporary composers to agonizingly produce these ultra-simple little tunes like Cherepnin and David Diamond and Tonsman, people like that. And they created this library, this remarkable achievement.
And over the course of the 45 years that you've known her, what would you say has been the evolution of her work? What has remained the same and what has changed?
I think her work has really been an almost seamless continuum. It's been constantly developing, constantly in process, and that, of course, is consistent with what she believes about teaching and learning, that they are a process, that they never end. And I think this is true of her work, that it has constantly grown and changed. One of the things that workshop attenders, teachers who have come to our summer workshops have always complained about is that, well, that's not what you said last year. And Frances has always responded, yes, isn't that a good thing? I'm learning and growing too.
I'd like to talk about the Frances Clark Library, which is among your earliest and most lasting contributions to the piano profession. I think we need a contrast, and the contrast would be where piano teaching was in the 1930s and the 1940s. The conditions for piano teachers, the resources that were available. Would you describe that period for us?
Yes, because that's where I lived. It really was an era where if you could play a second grade book, you taught. You could teach it. It was not a piano, the teaching profession didn't have status. I don't think it was considered taking any great mental effort. And I think that's why the people that I knew closely, didn't want me to go into piano teaching. They thought I could do something else, something bigger, something more important than piano teaching. And of course, I had just the opposite feeling that piano teaching could be very, very important. And then, of course, at that time, there weren't the materials. I spent hours going through music. I went to New York. I knew G. Shermer and Presser in Philadelphia intimately because of spending time in their stores just looking through music. Came from Kalamazoo to do that, or from Sturgis at that time.
You mean you traveled from Sturgis, Michigan, all the way to Presser in Philadelphia?
Philadelphia, yeah. To Shermer in New York, yes.
Oh my goodness, I had no idea.
Well, all there was were these limited number of courses, and of course the two most best known were John Williams and John Thompson. And while we were very lucky to have them, if you start thinking about what is teaching, then you have to manipulate them to make it fit what your thinking is. So it meant my looking always for music.
How did that library begin?
Well, a practical answer would be that 40 years ago, David Sengstack came to Kalamazoo to ask me to write a course of study. Any kind of course I wanted. The sky was the limit. I would have no interference from anyone else. And I had to think it over, of course. But the one requirement I made was that I wouldn't do it unless I could get Louise Goss to give up her teaching at the University of Michigan and come and help me. And here she was getting her doctorate, and she had a good position at the University of Michigan. And as you know, I won, and she came. She came with the idea of a few years while we would do the course. And of course, we're still doing it.
Throughout the decade of the 40s, you had teachers traveling for miles around to hear your studio recitals in Sturgis, Michigan. And then when you accompanied Guy Mayer on his many workshops, teachers were equally interested in your approach to reading. Which
I believe so too. I think they were.
And my question is, what is it that, if it's possible to pinpoint, what is it that teachers were missing? I mean, they knew about the Oxford series, they knew about John Thompson, they may quite likely have known about the work of Raymond Burroughs and Ella Mason and Ahern. What is it that was still missing for them, and what is it that your approach and ideas were providing for them?
Well, remember that books don't provide that. Books provide the material. They don't provide the how or the why. And among the teachers that I knew that came to me, they were all seemed to wake up, seemed to be fascinated by the difference in having a student discover something and being told something. So what they saw was something very active, something very living. And neither did they think that, now of course there have always been great teachers, always been, I'm sure. And that's, I certainly don't have a corner on how to teach teachers. But I do believe that music represents life. And if your life is maudlin, or if it's just doing one thing, doing page 10 today and page 11 tomorrow, there's nothing very exciting about it. But if you have a sense of adventure, your students will have a sense of adventure. If you have a sense of drama, your students will have a sense of drama. And I think the main thing really is in the children discovering for themselves that they can play beautifully, discovering for themselves they can do anything.
So in Time to Begin, for example, in which its units of study are divided into discoveries and using what you've discovered, and the emphasis that I know you place on the sense of adventure, that all came out of the situation in the 30s and 40s in which you felt the materials were not providing that sense of discovery and adventure, is that?
Well, I don't think the materials do yet. I don't think our materials do it. I think it's the people who use them that do it. It's it's the teachers. I have said many times that if I were on a far island and the only books I had to teach were some books that I didn't like at all, I could still teach. I could still use those books in some way. I'd maneuver around. It's not, it's the people. It's what you're thinking. What is your attitude? How do you feel about it? Is music an adventure for you? It's the most contagious thing in the world. And to see children learn is the most thrilling thing to do.
Can we call that a definition of teaching, perhaps? Is that who a teacher is someone that brings a sense of adventure, a sense of discovery to a musical situation, to a piano lesson?
Well, that's certainly one of the ways.
What
I would say the teacher creates the situation. Now, I don't mean by that the look of a room, or it'd be nice if it were pretty, and I don't mean equipment. I mean the state of mind of that teacher. Does that teacher have time to teach? Is that student just the very student he wants to see at that moment? Is the new music he's going to have this week going to be thrilling to both of you? You can't teach a piece of music you don't like. You're undone the moment you do. It takes imagination. A piano lesson should be a happening. Something happens at a piano lesson so that when you walk out of the studio, you feel different from when you walked in.
And one's life has changed.
Definitely.
In some
Definitely.
distinct way. Is there...
And parents know it.
What do you mean?
Parents are aware that their children change. And it's interesting to see them at the school right now, to sit in the waiting room and see them walk out of a class or walk out of a studio. They're happy. It's a happy situation. In fact, teaching and learning is the happiest situation there is. If I had just one thing, we want the parents to be interested. And the interest can show in just when the child comes home from his lesson, tell me about it. Or play something for me. It's an interest, of course, incorporates a lot of other things. Making sure that the student is on time for the lesson, that he practices every day. That it's a three-way thing for us. The student is always right. The student is always wonderful. And how he gets along depends on the teacher, the parents, and the material that's used. There's not a child that isn't wonderful.
And you've always felt so strongly that this music was in them.
That's right. Yes.
And so the teacher then uses that inner sense, the intuition that they are musical, and then uses the parents to support that. Can we say that?
Yes. You're making some very good summaries for me.
Well, thank you.
I think you've said a lot right there. You see, you started the premise. Anytime we take a student, we started the premise that there's music there. How much we don't know, but there is something there. Nobody's born unmusical. And no matter how small that seed is, you find it and you nurture it. You water it. You put it in the sunlight and it grows. And the faster it grows, the more it grows, the more wings it has, and it spreads. And the child who doesn't seem to be musical suddenly is playing very musically. And he's very thrilled about it.
So what is the technique that the teacher needs to learn? We know that piano performance has a technique, but it's always seemed to me that teaching has a technique. What is the technique involved in getting that seed to grow, in nurturing that innate musicality?
Now, I don't think you want the answer to that, but if you do, here goes. And I don't mean to have the answer. I don't mean for one moment that I do have the answer. But this is what I think and what I live by. In the first place, we have to know that the environment is right. The environment for learning must be a happy environment. And it must be full of great expectation. That's the mood. And then we know that what we're really teaching are just three things. We're teaching three senses: the sense of hearing, the sense of seeing, and the sense of touch. And when we develop a student who really hears, and then who sees what he hears, and then can do it at the piano, he already is playing the piano, which he does at the very first lesson. First he hears, and when he once hears it, plays it, he knows how to play it. Then we show him the picture of it.
So is that part of the technique that a teacher needs to learn, is that relationship of those three senses?
Absolutely. And when they ignore that, they've ignored the whole thing. If I were going to teach a young child staccato, something as simple as staccato, he already plays smoothly, so he knows what smooth is. I would begin with playing something. He'd come in and I'd just be playing something smoothly. And suddenly I would tell him I'm going to play those very same keys. Will you tell me what the difference in the sound is? And he might, so I play those same keys, but I play them staccato. And he might call it bouncy, he might call it jumpy. Whatever he calls it, I call it. He has named what he heard. See, first he heard it, then he named it. And we stay on that until he can tell the difference from in a phrase that had both legato and staccato. We know he's heard it. Then the next thing we do is show him how to play it. And it's very simple. He plays legato well. So we're going from the known to the unknown, you see. He plays a staccato. And then when he can do that, we show him the sign for it. But he doesn't. We don't begin with the sign. We begin with the sound. We go from the sound to the physical feel, then to the eye. See, we haven't told them that that's staccato. In fact, we don't even need the word. If you're teaching, you don't need the word staccato. The only reason you need the word is to talk about it. And of course, that's what most teachers do. All of us do. We talk about stuff instead of really do it. And I think that's maybe the crux of it. See, a name of a thing isn't important. It's what it is. You are much more important than your name, if I may say so.
That's wonderful.
Especially right at this moment.
Well, and a child would understand that.
Oh, children understand everything.
Yes.
Oh, yes. You see, adults, as we grow older, get so full of information that we've lost part of our sense of adventure and part of reality.
Because of what kinds of reasons? What happens with adulthood that we start to lose that risk-taking?
Well, I lay it to the way we stack up information. We have it. So we get it on the TV, we get it in reading, we get it in school. Even schools are trying hard to get rid of information and get into what is learning. And the movement, I think, in some schools today is beautiful, where the children, the main thing they do is learn how to learn.
Now, you're getting to a very controversial area because now we're in a back-to-basics movement, and there's so much consternation about the fact that the emphasis on process, the emphasis on learning how to learn, has not been successful.
Yes.
That's the accusation,
Yes.
but you firmly believe that it has been successful, or that it is successful.
Oh, well, we know it's successful when it's used. If you get with someone on the subject of education, that it always comes around to it comes around to John Dewey, for one. It comes around to the fact that we need to create experiences for the person. You must have the experience and then the name for it. It's always that. Think what would happen if the child had experience practicing the way you want him to practice, and then finally called that practice. So that when our children take a piece of music home, they don't take any piece, they'll ever take a piece that has anything in it that they haven't already experienced. So their job at home is merely to put together all these things they know. That's what practice is. It's not stumbling. It's not hard work. We don't hard work the piano, we play the piano.
So what is part of the skill of the teacher?
Well, that's what we teach at the new school.
That's what I want to know about.
Yes.
Louise, you share with Frances a notably similar background, family roots in Michigan, postgraduate study, undergraduate liberal arts background. You're as closely associated with the new school as Frances herself. What educational principles would you say have been the guiding light, something that the school bases all of its work upon?
Oh, those are wonderful questions. I think it all begins with the notion that there's music in every child, and that every child can learn to play the piano beautifully. Learning is a natural and logical process, that we go from the known to the unknown, that experience always precedes the sign that stands for that experience, or the name that stands for that sign. I think that the most innovative thing about the new school's whole approach to teacher training is the depth and intensity and extensiveness of the teaching internship.
My family moved to the East Coast, and I wound up studying piano at the new school. And it was there, under her charismatic influence, that I knew above all else that I wanted to become a piano teacher. At that point, I might have gone any direction. And it was the sense of just incredible positive influence that a teacher could have on a young person's life that led me into this line of work.
She was unwilling to settle for anything but a person's best. What might have been best today was to become better tomorrow. And that attitude prevailed. It was a way of life.
She was building a community of pianists. It wasn't piano students, and it was a group of people that were totally dedicated to the premise that the art of teaching and the art of performance are inseparable.
Frances and Louise taught the first pedagogy course that was ever offered at Westminster back in 1955. Then they were here for many years after, and then they moved to a new building called the New School. And when I met Frances and Louise and we began to talk together, I suggested that the time seemed ripe for a program that would include pedagogy at the New School. Students at Westminster are at Symphonic Choir, and they also take musicology, and of course they take their piano lessons. Daily, they are also at the New School, which is 4 miles up the road. They are teaching along with experienced teachers. They are being critiqued in their own teaching, and then they're doing some independent teaching totally on their own.
Frances, let's talk about the circumstances that led to the formation of the New School of Music Study. You were in Westminster Choir College at the time, and how is it that the New School needed to be created in light of your obvious success with Westminster Choir College?
Dr. Williamson, the president of Westminster, had heard about us, and he asked Louise and me to come here to be head of the piano department and to start a piano pedagogy department. I certainly think it's wonderful for undergraduates to study piano pedagogy, but we also had to meet those people who had already had at least a Bachelor of Arts. And we even had people who had already had their masters. And that wasn't possible at Westminster at that time. And so we started our new school. And I think that school was destined from the beginning. I think it began possibly back in Kalamazoo when I was teaching that first pedagogy course. There had to be a time when it could be concentrated in one place, in one building, with one ideal. And it happened then.
And what was that ideal?
A whole year when the only thing people worked on was either performance or learning how to teach. It meant hours of work. It meant hours and hours of teaching, practice teaching, because it was simultaneously observing teachers, having classes on how to teach, and doing teaching all the very same day.
So how did it feel that first day in September of 1960 when the doors to the new school opened for the first time?
Well, you want to know the truth?
Yes, I do.
Well, the truth was that the building wasn't ready. And we actually opened that very important school to us, important to us, in 3 churches on Nassau Street. It was chaos. Imagine all those children going to 3 different schools, 3 different churches to take piano lessons. And I think that lasted for about 6 weeks. Now, when we actually moved into the building, it was with such relief and such joy that we all wanted to celebrate. It was a big moment.
So it became even bigger by virtue of the obstacles.
That's right. That's right.
In our work with those who will be the teachers, her work has been to find ways to make them more able to bring out the music that is in that child.
Watching her in action in every kind of a situation, teaching a 7-year-old, working with pedagogy students, lecturing at a workshop. The examples were just phenomenal because she was everything that she was so successful in passing along.
Everybody she worked with, no matter how musical they were, they had a sense that there was something bigger here than just some notes and some fingering and a 40-minute session.
Frances, you've been on academic faculties at 2 institutions, Kalamazoo College and Westminster Choir College, and during 2 completely different periods in our country's history, pre-World War II,
That's right.
post-World
Yeah.
War II. I think that's a very special circumstance. And as a consequence, I want to ask, what do you believe to be the role of academe in our profession for piano teaching and for the training of piano teachers?
Well, no matter what your profession is, the more you know, the better. The more background you have, the better. You don't need to have read lots of Shakespeare plays to be able to teach piano. But you've had an experience, if you've read those Shakespeare plays, that may affect your playing. It's what I said first. The more you know, the greater experiences you had, the richer you are.
I guess my question really is this. What does piano pedagogy provide to aspiring pianists who are indeed someday going to teach?
I want them to know more about children. I want them to know more about what to expect of them at different ages to be able to teach. That's a study all in itself. I want them to know the history of education. How did it develop? What did we learn from Socrates? What did we learn from Comenius? We have all this store of wonderful thinking that we're not making use of.
How have we progressed as a profession? What is it that we do better now than we did before? And what do you believe we still have yet to do?
Well, I think we've progressed greatly. I think if I were to think about what I thought about teaching 50 years ago, what went on 50 years ago, and today, I would know one thing for sure: the standards for performance are much higher. But I think more important than that is the interest in people, the interest in the person who's learning. I think they're taking over.
Do you really?
I really do.
That's marvelous.
Or maybe I'm just hoping it. I know that's what we're trying to do.
You feel that teachers are developing a sensitivity to individual students.
That's right. You see, this is a people profession. It's not done through machinery. It's not done through equipment. It's one person, the teacher, teaching another person or a group of persons. So it's a with thing. We're with. It's not like doctors who do something for you or something to you, or lawyers who do something for you. Teachers do something with you. It's a with. And when the student is learning, the student is happy. And when the student is learning, the teacher knows that he is taught, and he's happy. So it's all very happy.
Francis, I'm going to ask one last question. If you had just one charge to give to every piano teacher in the United States, one great priority that you would want all of us to keep in mind every time that we taught, what would that charge be?
Now, when you're teaching first the student. Second, you're teaching music. And third, piano.
There are sayings that I think all of us teachers remember and use as guides for ourselves. And one of them that Francis says often is that teaching is not telling. I think that has enormous impact on how we get to the student. Another thing that she reminds us frequently is that we should not be in houses of correction. We shouldn't be in the business of correcting students, but rather of letting them grow and reinforcing good habits and their knowledge. She once said that discovery is the bud of knowledge, and that the student discovers and then learns, and the more one uses what he learns, the more he knows, and that is how knowledge evolves. And I find that kind of organization and that kind of beauty of expression is just an inspiration to me as a teacher.
I had a student whose mother called one day and said that the child had broken her arm. And naturally, I was very distressed, and I said, how long will it have to be in the cast? And she said, about 6 weeks. And I said, well, I really regret that. That means she'll have to stop lessons for 6 weeks. And the mother said, yes, I'm afraid so. So about 10 or 15 minutes later, the phone rang, and Frances was on the phone, and she said, I just ran into Mrs. So-and-so at the supermarket who told me that Ellen had broken her arm. What did you say to her? And I said, well, I told her how sorry I was, and that I was sorry I was going to miss seeing Ellen for 6 weeks. And she said, do you mean you turned down an opportunity to work with that child's left hand for 6 weeks?
One of my favorite stories about her is her now near legendary response in repertoire class to the student who has just played. And she looks at him with a burning intensity and says, bravo. But, and then goes on to find some big improvement that can be made. And that so much says how she was able to look for the good, to be supportive of the person, and then find how it could be better.
The Francis Clark Center is a not-for-profit educational organization that serves the advancement of piano teaching, learning, and performing. Divisions include Piano Magazine, PianoInspires Kids, Journal for Piano Research, National Conference on Keyboard Pedagogy, the New School for Music Study, Piano Education Press, International Online Teacher Education, and PianoInspires Online Community Hub. Please visit us at PianoInspires.com to learn more about our impactful work and inspiring community.